A bride-to-be vanished 48 hours before her wedding, leaving behind a cryptic voicemail that said only 3 words: "He's not who." For 4 years, everyone believed she'd gotten cold feet and run away. Then a hurricane uncovered something buried beneath her fiancé's beach house that would unravel the most twisted deception in Clearwater Bay's history. What investigators found wasn't just a body. It was evidence of an identity stolen, a life fabricated, and a killer who had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. Before we dive into this twisted mystery, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story from Ebube Stories. Give this video a like if you're ready for a case filled with shocking revelations that will keep you guessing until the very end. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. New York? London? Tokyo? I want to see our incredible community across the globe. The afternoon of October 13th, 2018, was supposed to be filled with final wedding preparations for SARAH Davidson and her fiancé, Dr. Marcus Webb. The couple had been together for 3 years, engaged for 8 months, and by all accounts were living the kind of life that made others envious. Marcus was a successful cardiologist at Clearwater Bay Medical Center, respected by colleagues and beloved by patients. SARAH worked as a senior editor at a prestigious publishing house, splitting her time between their beach house in Maine and the company's offices in Boston. They were attractive, successful, madly in love, and about to celebrate their union in front of 200 guests at the historic Lighthouse Point venue overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. But SARAH Davidson never made it to her wedding day, and the reasons why would take investigators down a rabbit hole of deception so complex, so carefully constructed, that it would shake the foundations of everything the people of Clearwater Bay thought they knew about the charming doctor who had become a pillar of their community. October 13th began normally enough. SARAH had taken the week off work to handle last-minute wedding details, while Marcus continued his regular hospital schedule. Her parents, Margaret and Harold Davidson, had arrived from Connecticut 3 days earlier and were staying at the couple's beach house, helping with preparations and enjoying time with their daughter before the big day. The morning had been spent finalizing seating arrangements, confirming vendor deliveries, and going over the timeline for the ceremony and reception. Margaret would later tell investigators that SARAH seemed perfectly happy, excited about the wedding, showing no signs of distress or second thoughts. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, SARAH told her mother she needed to run into town to pick up her altered wedding dress from the seamstress. It was a simple errand, the kind of task that should have taken maybe an hour at most. The seamstress's shop was only 15 minutes from the beach house, and SARAH had an appointment scheduled for 2:30. Margaret offered to come along, but SARAH insisted she could handle it herself, suggesting her mother rest and save her energy for the busy days ahead. It was a decision Margaret would replay in her mind thousands of times over the following years, wondering if things might have been different if she had just insisted on accompanying her daughter. SARAH left the beach house at 2:15, driving her silver Honda Accord toward downtown Clearwater Bay. Security footage from a gas station on Route 27 captured her car passing by at 2:23, heading in the right direction, nothing appearing unusual. She arrived at the seamstress shop at exactly 2:30, right on time for her appointment. The seamstress, an elderly woman named Rose Chun who had been altering wedding dresses in Clearwater Bay for 40 years, would later provide investigators with crucial testimony about those final minutes of SARAH Davidson's normal life. According to Rose, SARAH had seemed perfectly fine when she first arrived. Happy, chatty, excited about the wedding. They had gone through the final fitting, with SARAH trying on the dress one last time to ensure all the alterations were perfect. Everything fit beautifully. Rose had packaged the dress carefully in a garment bag, while SARAH changed back into her street clothes. But then, as SARAH was getting ready to leave, Rose's phone had rung. It was a vendor calling about another customer's order, and Rose had stepped into the back room to take the call, leaving SARAH alone in the front of the shop for perhaps 5 minutes. When Rose returned to the front, SARAH was standing frozen in the middle of the shop, staring at her phone with what Rose described as an expression of absolute horror. All the color had drained from SARAH's face. Her hands were shaking so badly, she nearly dropped the phone. Rose asked if everything was all right, if SARAH had received bad news, if there was anything she could do to help. But SARAH had barely seemed to hear her. She grabbed the garment bag containing her wedding dress, mumbled something incoherent about needing to go, and rushed out of the shop without another word. Rose watched through the shop window as Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot for several long minutes, making what appeared to be a phone call. Even from a distance, Rose could see that Sarah was crying, her whole body shaking with sobs. Then Sarah ended the call, started her car, and drove away. That was the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Davidson alive. What happened in those 5 minutes while Rose Chun was on the phone in the back room? What did Sarah see on her phone that transformed her from a happy bride-to-be into a terrified woman fleeing the seamstress shop? These questions would haunt the investigation for years, because Sarah's phone was never recovered, and whatever she had discovered in that moment died with her. At 4:30 that afternoon, Margaret Davidson began to worry. Sarah had been gone for over 2 hours, far longer than necessary for a simple dress pickup. Margaret called Sarah's cell phone, and it went straight to voicemail, suggesting the phone was either turned off or dead. She tried several more times over the next hour, growing increasingly concerned with each unanswered call. By 6 o'clock, when Marcus Webb arrived home from the hospital, Margaret was genuinely frightened. Marcus had immediately tried to calm Margaret's fears. Sarah probably ran into a friend and lost track of time, he suggested. Or maybe she had car trouble and her phone died. There were dozens of innocent explanations. But Margaret's maternal instincts were screaming that something was wrong, that her daughter wouldn't simply disappear without calling, wouldn't let her phone die when she knew her mother would worry. Marcus agreed to drive around town looking for Sarah's car, while Margaret and Harold stayed at the house in case Sarah returned. At 7:15, Margaret Davidson's phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, and Margaret answered with a mixture of relief and anger, ready to demand an explanation for why her daughter had been out of contact for so long. But the relief died instantly when she heard what was on the other end of the line. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It was a voicemail, left at some point during the afternoon when Margaret's phone had been in another room and she hadn't heard it ring. What Margaret heard on that voicemail would become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Sarah's voice, tight with panic, barely above a whisper. "Mom, I can't. He's not who," and then nothing. The voicemail cut off mid-sentence, as if Sarah had been interrupted or had ended the call deliberately. The timestamp showed the message had been left at 3:47, roughly an hour after Sarah had fled the seamstress shop. Margaret played the voicemail for Harold, then for Marcus when he returned from his unsuccessful search for Sarah's car. All three of them listened to those 7 words over and over, trying to extract meaning from the fear in Sarah's voice and the cryptic, incomplete warning. He's not who. Not who what? Not who she thought. Not who he claimed to be. And who was he? The most logical interpretation seemed to be that Sarah had discovered something about Marcus, something that had made her so frightened she couldn't even complete a phone call to her mother. But Marcus Webb appeared genuinely confused and concerned by the voicemail. He insisted he had no idea what Sarah could have been referring to, that there were no secrets between them, that everything about their relationship had been honest and open. He suggested that perhaps Sarah had discovered something about someone else, a vendor, a guest, someone connected to the wedding, and was trying to warn her mother. It seemed like a stretch, but Marcus's bewilderment appeared authentic. He agreed immediately when Harold suggested they call the police. The Clearwater Bay Police Department responded quickly to the missing person report, though with the cautious skepticism that often accompanies cases of missing adults. Detective Rachel Morrison took the lead on the case, interviewing Margaret, Harold, and Marcus that evening, listening to the voicemail, and beginning to piece together Sarah's last known movements. The voicemail was concerning, Detective Morrison agreed, but it wasn't necessarily evidence of foul play. Adults had the right to leave if they wanted to. Sometimes people got cold feet before major life events like weddings. The incomplete warning could have been about anything. But Detective Morrison also recognized elements that elevated this beyond a simple runaway bride scenario. Sarah had left her wedding dress behind in the car, which was found abandoned in a parking lot near the harbor at 10 o'clock that night. Her purse was still in the vehicle, containing her wallet, credit cards, and identification. The only thing missing was her cell phone. The car showed no signs of struggle, no damage, nothing to suggest violence. But it also made no sense that someone planning to run away would leave behind everything they needed to start a new life. The police investigation began in earnest on October 14th. the day Sarah was supposed to be having her wedding rehearsal and rehearsal dinner. Instead, search teams combed the coastline and woods around Clearwater Bay, looking for any sign of the missing woman. Detective Morrison interviewed everyone who had contact with Sarah in the days before her disappearance: friends, family members, co-workers, wedding vendors. She obtained security footage from every business along the route between the seamstress shop and the harbor where Sarah's car was found, trying to track Sarah's movements during those lost hours. What the footage revealed was troubling. Sarah's car had been captured on camera at 4:05, parked near the Clearwater Bay Public Library. The library's internal cameras showed Sarah entering the building at 4:07, moving quickly toward the computer terminals in the research section. She had logged onto a computer using a guest pass and had spent approximately 20 minutes searching for something online. The library's computer system showed her search history had been deliberately cleared before she logged off, but IT specialists were able to recover some fragments. The recovered searches were cryptic but disturbing: how to verify medical credentials, medical license verification Massachusetts, identity theft indicators, and most chilling of all, what to do if someone is not who they claim to be. These searches suggested that Sarah had been specifically investigating someone's credentials, someone's identity. Given the context of her voicemail, "He's not who," it seemed increasingly likely that Sarah had discovered something about Marcus Webb that had frightened her badly enough to send her fleeing to the library to research further. Detective Morrison brought Marcus in for additional questioning on October 15th. She asked him directly about his background, his medical credentials, his history before coming to Clearwater Bay. Marcus had provided his resume willingly: medical school at Stanford, residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, board certification in cardiology, 3 years of practice in California before relocating to Maine to join Clearwater Bay Medical Center. He offered to provide documentation for everything, seemed eager to cooperate in any way that might help find Sarah. His concern appeared genuine, his confusion about Sarah's research absolute. The police verified Marcus's credentials through the standard channels. His medical license was active and in good standing with the Massachusetts Board of Medicine. His employment history checked out. Colleagues at the hospital spoke highly of him, describing him as skilled, professional, dedicated to his patients. There were no complaints, no disciplinary actions, no red flags in his professional record. On paper, Dr. Marcus Webb was exactly who he claimed to be. But Detective Morrison's instincts told her something was wrong. The timing was too suspicious. Sarah discovers something that terrifies her, researches medical credentials and identity theft, leaves a panicked warning about someone not being who they claim to be, and then vanishes completely. If Sarah wasn't worried about Marcus, then who? And if she was worried about Marcus, why weren't the police finding any evidence to support her concerns? The investigation expanded to include a deeper dive into Marcus's background. Detectives contacted Stanford Medical School to verify his attendance. They reached out to Massachusetts General Hospital to confirm his residency. They checked with his previous employer in California. Every verification came back positive. Marcus Webb had attended Stanford. He had completed his residency at Mass General. He had worked at a cardiology practice in San Diego. Everything checked out perfectly, almost too perfectly. Days stretched into weeks with no sign of Sarah Davidson. Her bank accounts showed no activity. Her credit cards hadn't been used. Her cell phone remained off or destroyed. There were no reported sightings despite extensive media coverage of her disappearance. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air somewhere between leaving the library and abandoning her car at the harbor. The longer she stayed missing, the more likely it became that she hadn't run away, that something terrible had happened to her. Margaret and Harold Davidson remained in Clearwater Bay, refusing to leave while their daughter was missing, clinging to hope that Sarah might still be found alive. They stayed in contact with Detective Morrison daily, pushing for more investigation, more searches, more attention to Sarah's case. They organized volunteer search parties that combed every inch of Clearwater Bay and the surrounding areas. They hired a private investigator named Tom Reeves who had experience with missing persons cases. Tom Reeves brought a fresh perspective to the investigation. He was less constrained by official procedures and more willing to pursue unconventional theories. One of his first observations was that while Marcus Webb's credentials all checked out through official channels, there was surprisingly little trace of him online prior to his arrival in Clearwater Bay 5 years earlier. No social media presence before 2013. No tagged photos from medical school or residency. No digital footprint from his supposed years in California. In the modern world where everyone leaves traces of themselves all over the internet, Marcus Webb's pre-main life was remarkably absent from the digital record. Reeves decided to go beyond electronic verification and actually speak to people who supposedly knew Marcus during his earlier years. He contacted classmates from Stanford Medical School's class of 2007, when Marcus claimed to have graduated. None of them remembered a Marcus Webb in their class. Reeves obtained the actual class roster and confirmed that no Marcus Webb had graduated that year. He checked the years before and after. No Marcus Webb anywhere. This discovery sent Reeves immediately to Detective Morrison. If Marcus Webb hadn't graduated from Stanford in 2007, then how did he have a medical license issued based on Stanford credentials? The answer, they would discover, was more complex and more disturbing than either of them had imagined. The real Marcus Webb, the person whose identity had been used to obtain medical credentials, the person whose resume Marcus had been living under, had existed. He had graduated from Stanford Medical School. He had completed a residency at Mass General. He had been a rising star in cardiology. But the real Marcus Webb had died in 2012, killed in a car accident in Northern California at the age of 31, 6 months before the Marcus Webb currently living in Clearwater Bay had applied for his Maine medical license. The man living as Dr. Marcus Webb, the man SARAH Davidson had been about to marry, had stolen a dead doctor's identity and credentials, fabricating documentation and exploiting gaps in verification systems to pass himself off as a qualified cardiologist. He had been practicing medicine for 5 years, treating patients, making life and death decisions, performing procedures, all while having no medical training whatsoever. And SARAH, through some unknown means, had discovered this massive deception 2 days before she was supposed to marry him. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the truth revealed. Let's see who's truly following this shocking investigation and all its twisted turns. The revelation about Marcus Webb's stolen identity transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a manhunt. On November 2, 2018, police obtained an arrest warrant for the man calling himself Marcus Webb on charges of identity theft, fraud, and practicing medicine without a license. But when Detective Morrison and her team arrived at the beach house to execute the warrant, Marcus Webb was gone. The house was empty, cleared out with methodical precision. Marcus's personal belongings had been removed. His laptop and electronic devices were missing. Financial records showed he had withdrawn nearly $200,000 from his bank accounts over the previous 2 weeks, converting assets to cash in small enough amounts to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. His car was found abandoned at the Portland International Jetport, suggesting he had fled by plane, though passenger manifests under the name Marcus Webb showed nothing. He could have used a fake ID, could have driven to Boston or New York to fly from a larger airport, could have crossed into Canada by car. The trail went cold. Margaret and Harold Davidson were devastated by the news that their daughter's fiancé was an imposter and likely responsible for SARAH's disappearance. But they also felt a grim validation. SARAH had discovered the truth. She had been trying to warn them. He's not who she had said, and she had been absolutely right. Marcus Webb wasn't who he claimed to be. He was a fraud, a con artist, and now, almost certainly, a murderer. The question that haunted everyone was, who was he really? If he wasn't the real Marcus Webb, then who had spent the last 5 years living under that stolen identity? Despite extensive investigation, police were unable to determine the imposter's true identity. His fingerprints weren't in any database. DNA recovered from the beach house didn't match any known individuals. No one who had known him in Clearwater Bay could provide information about his real background because everyone had believed he was exactly who he said he was. The investigation into the false Marcus Webb's background revealed a con that was staggering in its ambition and execution. Someone had identified the real Marcus Webb shortly after his death, obtained his credentials and documentation, created a false identity good enough to pass medical board verification, and had then practiced cardiology for 5 years without anyone questioning his qualifications. The medical knowledge required to fake being a cardiologist was substantial. Investigators theorized that the imposter must have had some medical background. Perhaps he was a nurse, or a medical technician, or someone who had attended medical school but never completed it. He had enough knowledge to be convincing, but not enough to be legitimate. The more disturbing question was why. Why go to such extreme lengths to assume someone else's identity? Why choose cardiology specifically? And most troubling of all, was Sarah his first victim, or had there been others? Detectives began reviewing the medical records of patients who had died under Marcus Webb's care at Clearwater Bay Medical Center, looking for any suspicious patterns, any indication that the fake doctor might have killed patients either through incompetence or deliberately. Mercifully, they found nothing conclusive. Marcus's patient mortality rates were actually lower than average for cardiologists, suggesting that whatever his true background, he had been competent enough to avoid causing obvious harm. With Marcus Webb in the wind and no body recovered, the case against him for Sarah's murder was entirely circumstantial. Police believed Sarah had confronted him after discovering his fake identity, that he had killed her to protect his secret, and had then disposed of her body somewhere it hadn't been found. The abandoned car at the harbor suggested he might have weighted down her body and dumped it in the ocean. Alternatively, he could have buried her somewhere in the dense woods surrounding Clearwater Bay, or transported her body elsewhere entirely. Without physical evidence, without a confession, without even knowing the suspect's real name, the chances of ever prosecuting anyone for Sarah's murder seemed impossibly remote. Margaret and Harold Davidson held a memorial service for their daughter on what would have been her 29th birthday, 6 months after she vanished. There was no body to bury, no gravestone to mark, just photographs and memories of a life cut short by a man whose real name they didn't even know. The memorial was attended by hundreds of people, Sarah's friends, family, co-workers, and people from Clearwater Bay who had been horrified by the revelation that their trusted doctor was a fraud and likely a killer. The case remained open, but with no active leads, as 2019 turned into 2020 and then 2021. Detective Morrison retired in 2021, passing the cold case to a younger detective named Chris Park, who inherited boxes of files and a commitment to finding justice for Sarah Davidson. Tom Reeves, the private investigator, continued working the case pro bono, driven by the sense that he had failed to find answers quickly enough to save Sarah. The years passed slowly for Sarah's parents. Margaret and Harold sold their house in Connecticut and relocated permanently to Maine, buying a small home in Clearwater Bay so they could be near where their daughter had spent her last days. They became advocates for better medical credential verification, working with legislators to close the loopholes that had allowed a complete fraud to practice medicine for 5 years. They kept Sarah's memory alive through a foundation that provided scholarships for young editors, honoring their daughter's passion for publishing. But the lack of closure, the absence of justice, weighed on them constantly. Then, in September 2022, Hurricane Elena formed in the Atlantic and began tracking toward the New England coast. The storm was predicted to be one of the strongest hurricanes to hit Maine in decades, and Clearwater Bay was directly in its projected path. Residents began preparations, boarding up windows, securing boats, stocking emergency supplies. The town evacuated low-lying coastal areas, including the expensive beach houses along the cliff tops where Marcus Webb's former home still stood, now owned by a couple who had purchased it at a steep discount given its association with a murder case. Hurricane Elena made landfall on September 28, 2022, with sustained winds of 120 miles per hour and a storm surge that sent waves crashing 50 feet up the coastal cliffs. The hurricane devastated Clearwater Bay, tearing roofs from buildings, toppling century-old trees, and fundamentally reshaping the coastline. When the storm finally passed and residents began returning to assess the damage, they found a landscape transformed by Elena's fury. The beach house that had belonged to Marcus Webb was still standing, but barely. The cliff beneath the structure had partially collapsed, undermining the foundation and leaving one entire corner of the house hanging precariously over empty air. The new owners were devastated as they surveyed the damage, realizing the house would likely need to be condemned and demolished. But it was a construction worker named Eddie Santos, brought in to assess the structural damage, who made the discovery that would finally break the Sarah Davidson case wide open. Eddie was examining the foundation on the ocean-facing side of the house when he noticed something that didn't look right. The concrete foundation had cracked where the cliff had given way, and through one of the larger cracks, Eddie could see what looked like fabric. He He cleared away more loose concrete and soil, and suddenly he was staring at human remains, wrapped in heavy plastic and entombed in the foundation of the house. The police were called immediately. Detective Chris Park arrived on scene and knew instantly what they had found. The remains were extracted carefully over the next several hours by forensic teams working in hazardous conditions on the unstable cliff. When enough of the wrapping had been removed to examine the body, investigators found Sarah Davidson's wallet in a jacket pocket, confirming what everyone already suspected. After 4 years, Sarah had been found, buried literally beneath Marcus Webb's feet the entire time everyone had been searching for her. The forensic examination of Sarah's remains provided crucial new evidence about how she had died. Despite 4 years of exposure to moisture and concrete chemicals, enough tissue remained to determine cause of death. Sarah had been strangled, the hyoid bone in her throat fractured in a manner consistent with manual strangulation. But there was something else, something that added a new layer of horror to the case. Chemical analysis of the concrete surrounding Sarah's body revealed it had been poured sometime between October 15th and October 17th, 2018, meaning Sarah had been murdered and buried in the foundation while her parents were likely still inside the house above, waiting for news of their missing daughter. The discovery of Sarah's body generated renewed media coverage of the case and new appeals for information about Marcus Webb's whereabouts. The FBI had been involved in the manhunt since Webb's initial disappearance, but leads had been scarce. He had seemingly vanished as completely as he had made Sarah vanish. But the renewed publicity brought forward a new witness, someone who had seen news coverage of the case and recognized Marcus Webb despite the years that had passed. The witness was a woman named Linda Chun, a real estate agent in Burlington, Vermont. She contacted the FBI hotline to report that a man matching Marcus Webb's description had purchased a house through her agency in March 2019, just 5 months after he disappeared from Clearwater Bay. The man had used the name David Morrison and had paid cash for a modest property in a rural area outside the city. Linda had thought nothing of it at the time, but seeing Webb's photo on the news, she was certain it was the same person. FBI agents descended on the Burlington property on March 20th, 2023. They found it abandoned, but showing signs of recent habitation. The man calling himself David Morrison had apparently fled in a hurry, leaving behind personal items including a laptop that would prove to be an intelligence goldmine. The laptop's hard drive contained documents revealing that Marcus Webb had been just one of several false identities used by the same person over the past 15 years. The man's real name was Thomas Gregory Ashford, a former medical student who had been expelled from Duke University School of Medicine in 2004 for falsifying research data and plagiarizing significant portions of his thesis. Thomas had been 25 years old when his medical career ended in disgrace, and rather than accept failure, he had decided to become a doctor through deception rather than legitimate means. He had spent years learning how to create convincing false credentials, how to assume dead people's identities, how to exploit weaknesses in verification systems. Marcus Webb was actually Thomas's third complete identity theft. He had practiced as a physician assistant under a stolen identity in Oregon from 2005 to 2008 before the real credential holder's family realized someone was using their deceased relatives' information. Thomas had fled before being caught, relocated to Texas where he practiced as a nurse practitioner under another stolen identity from 2009 to 2012. That fraud had also eventually been discovered, forcing Thomas to reinvent himself once again as Marcus Webb. Each time his fraud was exposed, Thomas had simply moved on to a new identity and a new location, always staying ahead of investigators, always managing to create documentation convincing enough to fool employers and licensing boards. He had become, in effect, a professional identity thief who specialized in medical credentials. And he might have continued indefinitely if Sarah Davidson hadn't stumbled upon the truth. The laptop revealed what had triggered Sarah's investigation. She had been browsing online for honeymoon ideas on October 13th when she had stumbled across a memorial website for the real Marcus Webb, created by his family to honor his memory. The website included photographs from the real Marcus's life, and Sarah had immediately recognized that the man in those photos was not the man she was about to marry. They looked similar enough that a casual observer might not notice. But Sarah knew her fiancé's face intimately, and the subtle differences were unmistakable. Different shaped nose, different set to the eyes, different smile. Confused and frightened, Sarah had begun investigating, searching for information about the real Marcus Webb's death, trying to understand if she was somehow mistaken or if her fiancé had been lying to her about who he was. The more she discovered, the more terrified she became. She had tried to call her mother from the seamstress shop, but the words wouldn't come. "He's not who she had managed before panic overwhelmed her, and she fled to the library to research further, to verify what she was seeing, to make absolutely certain before she accused the man she loved of living a complete lie. At the library, Sarah had found enough evidence to confirm her worst fears. The real Marcus Webb was dead. The man she knew as Marcus had stolen his identity. Everything about their relationship had been built on deception. Sarah's laptop searches showed she had been researching how to report identity theft, trying to understand the legal implications, trying to figure out what to do with this information. She had apparently decided to confront Thomas directly, because cell phone records showed she had sent him a text message at 4:32 that afternoon. "We need to talk. I know everything. I'm coming home." That text message had sealed her fate. Thomas had known immediately that his carefully constructed life was about to collapse. He couldn't let Sarah expose him, couldn't let her destroy everything he had built. So when Sarah had returned to the beach house that evening, probably expecting to have a difficult conversation with her fiancé about his lies and what they meant for their relationship, Thomas had been waiting for her. He had likely tried to explain, to justify, to convince her to keep his secret. And when Sarah refused, when she made clear she was going to turn him in to the authorities, he had strangled her. The laptop contained detailed notes about how Thomas had hidden Sarah's body. He had stored it temporarily in a locked storage unit he'd rented under yet another false name. Then, over the next 3 days while Margaret and Harold Davidson waited desperately for news of their daughter, while search parties combed the woods and coastline, while Detective Morrison interviewed witnesses and reviewed surveillance footage, Thomas had been methodically preparing a concrete mix and structural reinforcement for what he told the Davidsons was a planned improvement to the beach house foundation. He had convinced them to stay at a hotel for a few nights, claiming the concrete work would create too much noise and dust for them to remain comfortable in the house. With Sarah's grieving parents safely away, Thomas had retrieved her body from the storage unit under cover of darkness, wrapped it in heavy plastic, and buried it in the foundation work he'd been preparing. Then he had poured fresh concrete over her, creating a tomb that he calculated would remain undiscovered indefinitely. The plan would have worked if not for Hurricane Elena, if not for the cliff collapse that cracked the foundation and exposed what had been hidden beneath. The laptop also revealed that Thomas had been planning his escape from the moment Sarah's body was buried. He had been systematically withdrawing cash, preparing false identification documents, researching locations where he could disappear and start over once again. The discovery of Sarah's car had accelerated his timeline, but he had still managed to execute his escape plan cleanly, becoming David Morrison in Vermont while police in Maine searched frantically for Marcus Webb. Based on the intelligence gathered from Thomas's laptop and the Burlington property, the FBI was able to track his movements over the previous 4 years. He had lived quietly in Vermont for 3 years, working as a medical equipment salesman, staying under the radar, and avoiding any situation that would require credential verification. Then, in early 2023, shortly before Hurricane Elena struck Clearwater Bay, Thomas had apparently become spooked by something. Possibly the increased security measures in medical credential verification that Margaret and Harold Davidson's advocacy had helped implement, and had fled Vermont for parts unknown. But the laptop provided one more crucial piece of information. Thomas Gregory Ashford had a pattern. Every time he relocated, he spent a few months researching and preparing his next identity before fully committing to a new location. And the laptop showed he had been in the research phase when he abandoned the Vermont property. His browser history revealed he had been looking at medical facilities in the Pacific Northwest, researching deceased physicians whose credentials might be assumed, investigating towns in Oregon and Washington where he might relocate. The FBI began working with local law enforcement in those areas, distributing Thomas's photo to hospitals and clinics, alerting credential verification boards to be on watch for suspicious applications. The break came on March 22, 2023, when a hospital administrator in Spokane, Washington contacted the FBI to report that a man matching Thomas's description had interviewed for a position as a physician assistant under the name Robert Chin. The administrator had been suspicious because the candidate seemed overly nervous and some of his references weren't checking out properly. FBI agents arrested Thomas Gregory Ashford outside his motel room in Spokane later that evening, finally ending his decade-and-a-half career as a medical fraud and bringing him to justice for SARAH Davidson's murder. Thomas was extradited to Maine and charged with first-degree murder, identity theft, fraud, and numerous other crimes. His trial began in September 2023, almost exactly 5 years after he had murdered SARAH and buried her beneath his beach house. The evidence against him was overwhelming. SARAH's body found exactly where his laptop notes described placing it, his detailed digital confessions documenting how he had killed her and hidden her remains, his long history of identity theft and deception establishing a pattern of behavior that made his guilt undeniable. Margaret and Harold Davidson attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row of the courtroom gallery, making sure Thomas Gregory Ashford had to face them, had to see the devastation he had caused. For the first time, they learned the full truth about what had happened to their daughter. They heard how SARAH had discovered Thomas's deception, how she had tried to do the right thing by confronting him, how he had murdered her rather than face the consequences of his lies. They heard how he had buried her in the foundation while they waited upstairs, grieving and hoping and praying for her safe return, while their daughter's body lay just below their feet. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Thomas's defense attorneys attempted to argue that SARAH's death had been accidental, the result of an argument that got out of hand, manslaughter rather than premeditated murder. But the prosecution's evidence made clear that Thomas had killed SARAH deliberately to silence her, had carefully planned the disposal of her body, and had executed an escape plan that demonstrated consciousness of guilt and sophisticated criminal planning. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. At sentencing, Margaret Davidson was permitted to give a victim impact statement. Through tears, she described the daughter she had lost, the brilliant editor and beautiful person SARAH had been, the future that had been stolen from her. She described the agony of not knowing for 4 years what had happened to SARAH, the torture of hoping she might still be alive while fearing the worst, the horror of learning she had been buried beneath the house the entire time. She looked directly at Thomas Gregory Ashford and told him that while he had taken SARAH's life, he had not broken SARAH's family, that SARAH's memory lived on in the Scholarship Foundation and in the laws that had been changed because of her case. Harold Davidson spoke next. His statement focused less on grief and more on rage at Thomas's absolute selfishness, his sociopathic willingness to destroy an innocent person's life to protect his fraudulent existence. Harold noted that Thomas had stolen not just the real Marcus Webb's identity, but his accomplishments, his reputation, his good name. He had stolen SARAH's future, her parents' hopes, and years of peace from dozens of people who had trusted him as their doctor, who now wondered if the man who had treated their heart conditions had even been qualified to do so. The judge sentenced Thomas Gregory Ashford to life in prison without the possibility of parole for SARAH's murder, plus additional consecutive sentences for the identity theft and fraud charges. Thomas would spend the rest of his life in prison, and unlike the false identities he had assumed and discarded throughout his criminal career, this would be a fate he couldn't escape or reinvent himself out of. He was led from the courtroom in shackles, a 54-year-old man who had wasted his intelligence and potential on deception and had ultimately destroyed lives, including his own. The resolution of SARAH Davidson's case brought closure to her family, but also raised troubling questions about how Thomas Gregory Ashford had managed to practice medicine under false credentials for so long. Investigations revealed that while credential verification systems existed, they relied heavily on documentation that someone with Thomas's skills could forge convincingly enough to pass initial screening. The deeper verification that would have revealed his fraud simply wasn't done routinely in most cases. Thomas had identified and exploited this weakness systematically, understanding that most employers and licensing boards would verify that credentials existed, but wouldn't verify that the person presenting them was actually the person to whom they had been issued. Margaret and Harold Davidson's advocacy work led to significant reforms in medical credential verification across multiple states. New protocols required biometric verification, cross-referencing of multiple documentation sources, and random audits of practicing physicians to ensure credentials remained valid and matched the actual practitioner. These reforms came too late for Sarah, but would potentially prevent future Thomas Ashfords from stealing identities and practicing medicine fraudulently. The beach house where Sarah had been buried was demolished in late 2023. The property was purchased by the town of Clearwater Bay and converted into a memorial park honoring Sarah's memory. A simple stone monument was erected on the site, bearing Sarah's name, her dates of birth and death, and a quote she had loved from a famous author. "The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable." The irony was not lost on anyone that Sarah had died because she discovered the truth and tried to act on it, that her commitment to honesty had cost her everything, but had ultimately led to justice. The resolution of the case brought some measure of peace to Clearwater Bay, a community that had been shaken by the revelation that their trusted doctor was a fraud and murderer. The town held a memorial service at the new park on what would have been Sarah's 33rd birthday, attended by hundreds of residents who wanted to honor a woman who had represented the best of humanity: honest, kind, trusting, and ultimately a victim of someone who represented the worst. For Margaret and Harold Davidson, Sarah's death would never make sense, would never be anything but a senseless tragedy. But they found purpose in ensuring her death had meaning, that the laws changed because of her case would protect others, that her memory lived on in the young editors who received scholarships in her name, in the memorial park where families gathered, in the story of a woman who discovered a terrible truth and paid the ultimate price for her integrity. Thomas Gregory Ashford sits in prison today, serving a life sentence for his crimes. He has never expressed genuine remorse for killing Sarah, has never apologized to her family, has never shown any sign of understanding the profound evil of what he did. In rare interviews, he has described his actions in clinical, detached terms, as if Sarah's murder was simply an unfortunate necessity in protecting his interests. This complete lack of empathy or conscience suggests that even without his fraudulent medical career, Thomas would have been a dangerous person, someone fundamentally broken in their moral compass and ability to value other human lives. The case serves as a chilling reminder that the people we trust most, doctors, teachers, professionals we rely on for our well-being, are sometimes not who they claim to be. Thomas Gregory Ashford managed to deceive everyone for over a decade, playing the role of a caring physician so convincingly that no one questioned him until it was too late. Sarah Davidson saw through his disguise, recognized the truth beneath the lies, and lost her life because of it. But Sarah's story is also a testament to the power of persistence in seeking justice. For 4 years, the case seemed unsolvable, with no body, no suspect in custody, and no clear path to prosecution. Margaret and Harold Davidson never gave up hope that the truth would eventually emerge. Detective Chris Park and Tom Reeves continued investigating even when the trail went cold. And ultimately, nature itself intervened through Hurricane Elena, exposing what had been hidden and setting in motion the chain of events that led to Thomas's capture and conviction. The case also demonstrates that no matter how carefully a crime is planned, no matter how meticulous a killer's attempts to hide evidence, the truth has a way of emerging. Thomas thought he had created the perfect hiding place for Sarah's body, a foundation that would preserve his secret indefinitely. He couldn't have predicted a hurricane powerful enough to crack that foundation and expose what he had buried. He couldn't have predicted that his own digital record-keeping would provide investigators with a complete confession. His intelligence and planning were ultimately undone by forces beyond his control and by his own arrogance in documenting his crimes. The final twist in the Sarah Davidson case came in late 2023 when investigators reviewing Thomas's laptop discovered encrypted files they had initially been unable to access. Forensic specialists eventually broke the encryption and found that Thomas had been keeping detailed journals of his entire criminal career, dating back to his expulsion from medical school. The journals revealed that Sarah Davidson had not been his first victim. In 2011, while practicing under his second stolen identity in Texas, Thomas had been dating a woman named Jennifer Martinez, a nurse who worked at the same hospital. Jennifer had apparently discovered irregularities in Thomas's credentials and had confronted him about them. According to Thomas's journal entries, he had managed to convince Jennifer that the irregularities were simple administrative errors, that he would resolve them immediately. But Jennifer had remained suspicious and had started her own investigation. Thomas's journal described how he had staged Jennifer's death to look like a suicide, making it appear that she had overdosed on medication stolen from the hospital. The death had been investigated and ruled a suicide, with investigators concluding that Jennifer had been struggling with depression and had taken her own life. Thomas's journal made clear that he had murdered Jennifer to silence her, just as he would later murder Sarah for the same reason. The discovery led to Jennifer Martinez's case being reopened by authorities in Texas. Her body was exhumed, and new forensic testing revealed evidence that had been missed in the original investigation. Bruising consistent with someone being forcibly held down. Chemical traces suggesting she had been injected with the overdose rather than self-administering it. The case was reclassified as a homicide, and Thomas Gregory Ashford was charged with Jennifer's murder as well. Jennifer's family, who had spent 12 years believing their daughter had taken her own life, were devastated to learn the truth, but also relieved to finally understand that Jennifer had not died by suicide, that she had been murdered by the same man who would kill again for the same reason. They attended Thomas's second trial in Texas in early 2024, where he was convicted of Jennifer's murder and received another life sentence. The revelation of a second victim raised the question of whether there might be others. Thomas's journals suggested that Jennifer and Sarah were his only murder victims, but investigators couldn't be certain. They began reviewing suspicious deaths in every location where Thomas had practiced under false credentials, looking for patterns, for women who had died unexpectedly after being romantically involved with him or who might have discovered his secrets. As of the end of the investigation, no additional murders were conclusively linked to Thomas, but the possibility remains that there may be other victims whose deaths were never recognized as homicides. The complete story of Thomas Gregory Ashford reveals a man who spent his entire adult life living in lies, creating false identities, stealing the accomplishments of others, and ultimately murdering anyone who threatened to expose him. He had the intelligence and capability to have become a successful professional through legitimate means, but somewhere in his psychological development, he had lost the ability to accept honest failure or to value other people's lives as equal to his own. He became a parasite who fed off others' identities and destroyed anyone who recognized him for what he really was. For Margaret and Harold Davidson, the revelation that Sarah had not been Thomas's first victim added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. If Jennifer Martinez's death had been properly investigated, if Thomas had been caught and imprisoned in 2011, Sarah would still be alive today. She would be in her mid-30s, pursuing her publishing career, possibly married to someone worthy of her trust, maybe raising children of her own. Instead, she had been murdered at 28 by a man who viewed her life as disposable, as nothing more than an obstacle to be eliminated in service of his fraudulent existence. But Margaret and Harold found some comfort in knowing that Thomas would never hurt anyone else, that his life of deception had finally ended, that he would spend whatever years remained to him in prison paying for his crimes. They hoped that Sarah and Jennifer could rest in peace knowing their killer had been brought to justice. They hoped that the reforms enacted because of these cases would prevent future Thomas Ashfords from practicing medicine fraudulently. And they hoped that Sarah would be remembered not as a victim, but as a person of integrity who discovered an uncomfortable truth and tried to do the right thing with it. The Memorial Park in Clearwater Bay has become a place where people gather to reflect on the importance of truth and integrity, on the dangers of deception, and on the tragic cost of one man's sociopathic refusal to accept accountability for his failures. School groups visit to learn about Sarah's story and the importance of verifying credentials and questioning things that don't seem right. Medical students study the case as a cautionary tale about gaps in credential verification and the need for constant vigilance. And every year on the anniversary of Sarah's death, Margaret and Harold Davidson stand at her memorial stone and remember their daughter not as she died, but as she lived, honest, loving, brave, and true. If you made it to the end of this twisted tale of deception and murder, please hit that like button to help this story reach more people. Subscribe to Ebube Stories for more gripping fictional crime narratives that explore the darkest corners of human nature. And share your thoughts in the comments. What shocked you most about this case? Could you have seen through Thomas's deception? What reforms do you think are most important to prevent cases like this? Let's continue this conversation. Thank you for watching. And remember, the truth may be painful, but lies can be deadly.